They say silence is expensive, but in that room, it cost exactly $1.2 billion. 1 minute, Julian Thorne, the Wolf of Wall Street, was laughing at a waitress's shoes, telling his partners that people like her were the background noise of society. The next, he was watching his empire crumble in real time because his Ivy League translator didn't know the difference between a compliment and a declaration of war. He looked at her, the woman he'd just humiliated, with terror in his eyes. He didn't know who she really was. But he was about to find out that the background noise spoke 9 languages and held his future in her hands. The air inside l'Orangerie didn't smell like food. It smelled like old money and fear. It was the kind of New York establishment where a salad cost more than a month's rent in Queens, and the clientele treated the staff not like servants, but like furniture. Her name was Annie Vance. To the world, she was just a blur of black vest and white apron, a pair of hands pouring vintage Chateau Margaux without spilling a drop. To her landlord, she was 3 days late on rent. But in her head? In her head, she was reciting the poetry of Rumi in Farsi, or debating the nuances of contract law in Mandarin. Annie was 26, broke, and hiding a brain that the Defense Intelligence Agency would have killed to recruit. But life is complicated. When one's father is a disgraced diplomat who died leaving nothing but debt and a library of foreign dictionaries, one doesn't go to the UN. One goes where the tips are cash. That Tuesday started like any other, which is to say, terrible. "Table 4 is yours, Annie," the maitre d', Claude, hissed at her, adjusting his silk tie. "And for the love of God, don't make eye contact. It's Julian Thorne." Annie's stomach dropped. Julian Thorne, CEO of Thorne Capital. He was 32, worth $4 billion, and had a reputation for shredding waitstaff for sport. He was currently trying to close the Aurora deal, a massive $1.2 billion acquisition of a clean energy consortium involving German engineering giants and Japanese tech investors. She smoothed her apron and walked over. Julian was sitting with his CFO, a nervous man named Marcus. Julian looked exactly like he did in Forbes. Sharp jawline, ice blue eyes that looked bored by the concept of existence, and a bespoke suit that cost more than Annie's entire education. "Sparkling," he said, not looking up from his phone. "Right away, sir." She poured the water. As she reached across to place the bread basket, her sleeve caught the edge of his phone. It didn't fall. It didn't even slide. It just shifted. Maybe an inch. Julian stopped typing. The silence at the table was sudden and violent. He slowly looked up, his eyes traveling from his phone to her hand, then up to her face. He looked at her with a mix of amusement and disgust, like she was a particularly interesting stain on a rug. "Do you know how much this deal is worth?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. I apologize, sir. I didn't mean to." "It's worth $1.2 billion, he interrupted, leaning back. "And do you know what you are worth?" Marcus, the CFO, looked down at his plate, embarrassed. Annie started, her face burning. "Nothing." Julian smiled. It was a cruel, shark-like smile. "In the grand scheme of this room, you are statistically irrelevant. You are here to move objects from point A to point B. If you interfere with the people actually changing the world, you become a liability. You're the background noise of society. Try to be quieter." He flicked his hand, dismissing her. "Get me a new fork. This one has been exposed to your incompetence." Annie stood there, frozen, her hands clenched into fists behind her back. She wanted to tell him that in background noise, she could hear the dialect of his Bavarian partners better than he ever could. She wanted to tell him that the Aurora deal was named after the Roman goddess of dawn, and he was about to let the sun set on his career. But she needed the tips. "Yes, sir," she whispered. As she walked away, she heard him laugh to Marcus. "God, it's tragic. Imagine living a life where your biggest responsibility is carrying bread." She retreated to the kitchen, her heart pounding a rhythm of rage against her ribs. Just survive the shift, Annie. Just survive the shift. But the shift was about to get much, much worse. At 8 p.m., the private dining room, the Vanderbilt suite, was sealed off. This was it, the signing dinner. The guests arrived with an entourage of security. On one side, the Germans, led by Heinrich von Amsel, a stoic industrialist who looked like he was carved out of granite. On the other, the Japanese delegation, headed by Kenji Yamamoto, a tech visionary known for his traditional values and ruthless business acumen. And in the middle, Julian Thorne, looking like a king holding court. There was just one problem. Annie saw it the moment she walked in with the appetizers. The translator. His name was Brad. She knew the type immediately. He was young, sweaty, and wearing a suit that was trying too hard. He had likely studied international business at a mid-tier university and spent a semester abroad in Berlin and Tokyo, partying more than studying. He was Julian's nephew's friend, or some nepotism hire meant to save money on a professional interpreter. Julian was cheap like that. He'd spend millions on a yacht, but skimp on the one guy needed to bridge the gap. Annie took her station in the corner, blending into the wallpaper as instructed. The dinner began pleasantly enough, mostly English pleasantries, but as the wine flowed and the contracts appeared on the table, the language switched. The heavy hitters didn't want to speak English. They wanted to negotiate in their tongues to ensure precision. "We need to discuss the liquidation preference," Mr. Yamamoto said in Japanese, his voice soft but firm. Brad, the translator, nodded vigorously. He says, he is happy with the liquid. The drinks." Annie blinked. "What?" Julian smiled, raising his glass. "Excellent. Glad you're enjoying the wine." Mr. Yamamoto frowned. He looked at his aide, confused. He hadn't mentioned wine. He was talking about liquidation preference. Who gets paid first if the company goes under? It was a crucial, aggressive financial term. Then Heinrich von Amsel spoke up in rapid-fire German. "Wir müssen sicherstellen, dass die Patente nicht übertragen werden, bevor die Zahlung erfolgt. We must ensure the patents are not transferred before payment is made." Brad turned to Julian, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. von Amsel says he wants to make sure the parents? No, the partners are transferred before he pays." Annie's breath hitched. That was the exact opposite of what he said. Julian nodded, looking bored. "Tell him that's fine. We can transfer the partners immediately." Brad translated that back into German. Von Amsel's face went red. He slammed his hand on the table. "Was? Sie wollen uns bestehlen? What? You want to rob us?" The room temperature dropped 10 degrees. "What's he saying?" Julian snapped, looking at Brad. He's very passionate," Brad stammered. "He says he is surprised." "Good," Julian smirked. "Aggressive energy. I like it." Annie was physically pained watching this train wreck. It was like watching a blind man walk toward a cliff edge while his guide told him it was a beach. Then came the death blow. Mr. Yamamoto, sensing the tension, decided to switch to a proverb to ease the mood, a common Japanese tactic. He spoke metaphorically about building a bridge over troubled water. Brad, looking like he was about to vomit, translated, he says, "Your water is troubled, and he wants to build a bridge to get away from you." Julian's ego, fragile as spun glass, shattered. He stood up, throwing his napkin on the table. Get away from me, Julian barked. I'm the one buying him out. Tell him if he wants to walk, he can walk. I don't need his bridge. Brad translated. Mr. Yamamoto stood up. The German delegation stood up. This is an insult, Yamamoto said in English, his accent thick with rage. You mock our culture. You mock our terms. I mock your terms, Julian shouted. You're the one asking for liquid drinks and partner transfers. The deal was dead. $1.2 billion was evaporating because Brad, the nepotism hire, didn't know the German word for patent and the Japanese word for liquidation. Security was moving in. The guests were gathering their briefcases. Julian was red in the face, looking for someone to blame. His eyes landed on Annie. She was standing near the door, holding a tray of untouched petit fours. You, Julian shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. You brought the wrong wine earlier. This bad energy. It started with you. Get out! Get out of my sight! It was irrational. It was insane. But he needed a scapegoat, and the background noise was the easiest target. The room fell silent. Von Amsel and Yamamoto looked at Julian with pure disdain. A man who yells at a waitress in the middle of a business collapse is a man with no honor. Annie looked at Julian. Then she looked at the confused, angry faces of the foreign delegates. She had a choice. She could walk out that door, let Julian lose his billion, and go home to her instant noodles. It would be sweet justice. But then she looked at the documents on the table. This deal wasn't just money for Julian. It was clean energy technology that could save thousands of lives in developing nations. Her father had written a thesis on this specific tech before he died. He believed in it. She couldn't let Brad destroy her father's legacy just because Julian Thorne was a jerk. She took a deep breath. She set the tray down on a side table with a loud clatter. The sound echoed in the silent room. She walked past Julian. She didn't look at him. She walked straight up to Mr. Yamamoto. "Excuse me," she said. "Get her out of here," Julian roared to his security. She ignored him. She bowed to Mr. Yamamoto, a perfect 90-degree bow held for the culturally appropriate 3 seconds. When she straightened up, she looked him in the eye and spoke, not in English. "Yamamoto-san, gokai o manete moshiwake arimasen. Watashitachi no tuyaku ga seisan yusen ken to in Rio o kondo shimashita." Mr. Yamamoto, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Our interpreter confused liquidation preference with beverages. Mr. Yamamoto froze. His eyes went wide. She didn't stop. She turned to von Amsel, pivoting seamlessly into High German. "Herr von Amsel, es gab einen schweren Übersetzungsfehler. Herr Thorne hat nicht zugestimmt, Ihre Partner zu transferieren. Er stimmte zu, die Patente zu schützen, wie Sie es verlangt haben." Mr. von Amsel, there was a grave translation error. Mr. Thorne did not agree to transfer your partners. He agreed to protect the patents, as you demanded. Von Amsel's jaw dropped. He looked from Annie to Brad, then to Julian. She turned back to Julian. The room was so quiet one could hear the traffic from Fifth Avenue, 40 floors down. Julian Thorne was staring at her. His face wasn't angry anymore. It was pale. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. "What?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "What did you just do?" She smoothed her apron, her face a mask of professional indifference. "I just fixed your background noise, Mr. Thorne," she said calmly. "Now, if you want this $1.2 billion, I suggest you fire Brad and pull up a chair for me, because we have a lot of work to do." The silence that followed her declaration was heavier than the oak table they were sitting at. Julian Thorne looked like a man who had just watched a pigeon solve a calculus equation. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Brad, the sweaty nephew translator, and then back at Annie. You speak. Julian trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the air. Japanese and German, she finished for him, her voice cool. And French, Mandarin, Arabic, Spanish, Russian, and Italian. Now, are we going to save this deal, or should I go back to the kitchen and fetch the dessert spoons? Mr. Yamamoto sat back down slowly. The anger in his posture had evaporated, replaced by intense curiosity. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Not as a waitress, but as an equal. Please, Yamamoto said in English, gesturing to the empty chair next to him. Sit. She can't sit, Julian snapped, his reflex to control the situation kicking in. She's staff. It's against protocol. Heinrich von Omsel, the German industrialist, laughed. It was a dry, barking sound. Mr. Thorne, your protocol just cost us 20 minutes of insults. If this young woman leaves the room, the deal leaves with her. Julian's face turned a shade of purple Annie had only ever seen on bruised plums. He looked at her, hate and desperation warring in his eyes. He knew he was trapped. He needed the background noise to become the conductor. Sit down, he grit out through clenched teeth. Please! Annie didn't sit immediately. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the side table next to the discarded petit fours. Underneath, she was wearing a simple white button-down and black slacks, the uniform of the invisible class. But as she took the chair between the billionaires, she felt like she was wearing armor. Brad, Julian said without looking at him, get out. Brad fled like a frightened rabbit. The mood shifted instantly. Annie turned to Mr. Yamamoto. Let us clarify the liquidation preference, she said in Japanese. Mr. Thorne is proposing a 1x non-participating preference. He is not asking for priority over your initial capital, only on the upside profits. Yamamoto nodded, his shoulders relaxing. Aha, that is reasonable. The previous interpreter said he wanted to liquidate my assets. Miscommunication, she said smoothly. Then she turned to von Amsel. And regarding the patent, sir, the contract states that IP rights remain in Germany until the final tranche of 400 million is wired. Mr. Thorne is not asking for a transfer. He is asking for a license to use the technology in North America pending the final sale. Von Omsel grunted, impressed. Precision. That is all I asked for. Precision. For the next 2 hours, she wasn't a waitress. She was the bridge between 3 continents. The negotiations were brutal. Julian was aggressive, pushing for lower valuations. Yamamoto was conservative, demanding long-term security. Von Amsel was technical, obsessed with engineering specs. Annie didn't just translate words, she translated intent. When Julian said, "Tell them this is my final offer, or I walk," she didn't translate the threat. She turned to the group and said, in their respective languages, Mr. Thorne is reaching the limit of his current authorization, but he is very eager to find a middle ground. When von Amsel called Julian a greedy American vulture, she translated it as, Mr. von Amsel is concerned about the profit margins. She was spinning plates, but this time the plates were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Julian watched her the whole time. He wasn't taking notes. He was just staring. It was unnerving. The man who had mocked her shoes was now hanging on her every syllable. Around 10:30 p.m., they hit a wall. The Aurora deal hinged on a specific lithium-ion battery technology. Julian wanted exclusive rights. The Germans refused. It was the deadlock that had killed the deal 3 times before. Tell them, Julian said, leaning forward, sweat glistening on his forehead, that if they don't give me exclusivity, I'll source the tech from their competitors in South Korea. I have a meeting with Samsung next week. It was a bluff, a terrible, transparent bluff. If Annie translated that, von Amsel would laugh in his face. The Germans knew Julian had no other options. She looked at Julian. "I'm not translating that." Julian's eyes widened. "Excuse me? You work for me? Well, you're working for me right now. Translate it." "If I say that, they will walk," she whispered harshly. "They know you're bluffing. Von Amsel plays golf with the CEO of Samsung. He knows you don't have a meeting." Julian froze. "How do you know that?" "Because I read the Frankfurter Allgemeine newspaper every morning," she hissed. "Page 6, business section. Now, do you want to feel big, or do you want to get rich?" Julian stared at her. For a moment, she thought he was going to fire her again. His ego was bruising in real time. But then, the capitalist in him won. "What do I say?" he whispered. "Ask for a 5-year exclusivity clause with a performance review," she coached him. "Give them an out if you fail to meet sales targets. It lowers their risk." Julian swallowed hard. He nodded. "Okay, say that." She presented the new terms. Von Amsel conferred with his team. They whispered, looked at charts, and then looked at Annie. "Agreed," Von Amsel said. The room let out a collective breath. The tension broke. Pens were uncapped. Signatures were scratched onto thick, cream-colored paper. $1.2 billion. Sealed. Waiters, her co-workers, came in with champagne. They looked at her sitting at the head of the table, their eyes wide with shock. Claude, the maitre d', looked like he was having a stroke. Julian stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked like the master of the universe again. The fear was gone, replaced by the arrogance of victory. He shook hands with Yamamoto and Von Amsel. They were beaming. "Mr. Thorne," Yamamoto said in broken English, "your assistant, she is remarkable, the best we have ever worked with." "Yes," Von Amsel added. "Where did you find her? Harvard? Oxford?" Julian stiffened. He looked at Annie. She was standing now, feeling suddenly exhausted and out of place in her cheap slacks among the couture suits. "She's—" Julian paused. He didn't want to admit she was the waitress he'd humiliated. "She's a special consultant. Very exclusive." "I can see why," Von Amsel said. He handed her his card. "If you ever tire of this American cowboy, call me in Munich. We pay double." She took the card with 2 hands. "Dankeschön, Herr von Amsel." The guests left, ushered out by security. The room emptied until it was just Annie, Julian, and Marcus, the CFO. The silence returned. But this time it wasn't expensive. It was awkward. Julian poured himself a glass of champagne. He didn't pour one for her. He downed it in one gulp, then turned to face her. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice wasn't grateful. It was suspicious. "Waitresses don't speak 9 languages. Waitresses don't know who the CEO of Samsung plays golf with. Who sent you? Are you corporate espionage? A spy?" Annie laughed. It was a tired, bitter sound. "A spy? Mr. Thorne, if I were a spy, I wouldn't be serving you bread rolls for minimum wage plus tips." "Then explain," he demanded, stepping closer, "because what just happened doesn't make sense." "My name is Annie Vance," she said quietly. Julian frowned. "Vance? Like Arthur Vance?" She looked down at her scuffed shoes, the ones he had mocked hours ago. "He was my father." Julian's face went slack. Arthur Vance, the diplomat, the man who negotiated the peace protocols in the Balkans, the man who was framed for the embassy embezzlement scandal? "He wasn't framed," she said, her voice hard. "He was set up by people he trusted. He died of a heart attack 2 years ago, trying to clear his name. The government seized everything. Our house, his pension, his accounts. I was halfway through my master's at the Sorbonne when the money ran out. So I came home, and now I serve pasta to people who have more money than manners." Julian stared at her. The pieces were clicking into place. The pedigree, the languages, the understanding of high-stakes negotiation. Arthur Vance was a legend, Marcus, the CFO, whispered. If she has half his talent— I have all of his talent, Annie said, and none of his patience. She picked up her apron. The deal is signed, Mr. Thorne. You have your $1 billion. I assume my shift is over? Julian looked at the apron in her hand. He looked at the signed contracts. You're not going anywhere, he said. Excuse me? You're fired, Julian said. Her heart stopped. What? After everything? You're fired as a waitress, Julian clarified. He walked over to the table and picked up the contract. I need you on my team. Brad is gone. My VP of International Relations is an idiot. I need someone who can actually think. He pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something and tore it out. He held it out to her. $50,000, he said. That's a retainer. Your salary will be $200,000 a year, plus bonuses. You start tomorrow, 7 to Saluos's a.m. She looked at the check. It was more money than she'd seen in 3 years. It was freedom. It was rent. It was a chance to clear her father's name. But she looked at Julian's face. He still looked arrogant. He still thought he could buy people. I have conditions, she said. Julian raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to negotiate. You're broke. And you, she said, pointing at the contract, just signed a deal that involves a clause written in Portuguese in the appendix. Did you read it? Julian froze. There is no Portuguese in the contract. It's English, German, and Japanese. There's a shell company listed in the Annex B financials, she said. Listed as Rio Verde Holdings. The footnotes regarding its liability are in Portuguese because it's a Brazilian entity. I saw it when I was flipping through the pages for von Amsel. So? Julian asked, looking nervous. So, she said, leaning in. Unless you speak Portuguese, you probably missed the fact that Rio Verde Holdings is carrying $400 million in toxic debt that you just agreed to absorb. Julian dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the floor. What? He wheezed. You didn't just buy a clean energy company, Julian, she said, using his first name for the first time. You bought a sinking ship. Someone in that room set you up. And since von Amsel and Yamamoto seemed happy, I'm guessing they aren't the ones who hid the debt. She looked at Marcus, the CFO. Marcus's face had gone the color of ash. You have a mole, she whispered, and I'm the only one who can help you find them before the SEC does. The shattered glass lay on the floor between them, sparkling under the chandelier like diamonds. But Julian wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at Marcus. Marcus, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. What is she talking about? Marcus swallowed hard. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling. Julian, she's a waitress. She's probably reading it wrong. Portuguese, please. It's standard boilerplate. I don't make mistakes, Annie cut in. The clause uses the term dívida ativa, no recuperável, unrecoverable active debt. It was buried under the environmental compliance section. Why would a German-Japanese consortium route their environmental compliance through a Brazilian shell company, Marcus? Julian turned his gaze back to his CFO. Marcus had been with him for 5 years. He was the numbers guy, the safe pair of hands. Show me, Julian demanded. Marcus hesitated. The documents are already packed away in the secure briefcase. Open the damn briefcase, Marcus, Julian roared. Marcus fumbled with the latches. He pulled out the thick stack of papers. Annie flipped to the back. Annex B, page 42. There, she pointed. Julian squinted at the fine print. He pulled out his phone and used a translation app. He scanned the text. The app processed for a second, then spit out the result. liability for 400 million USD in non-performing assets held by Rio Verde. Julian looked up. His eyes were cold. You tried to bankrupt me. No, no, Marcus stammered, backing away. It was von Amsel. He told me it was just a formality. He said if I kept quiet about the shell company, they'd give me a seat on the new board. Julian, listen, the company is still good. The debt can be restructured. Get out, Julian said. Julian, please, get out before I throw you out the window. Marcus grabbed his briefcase and ran. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs. Julian stood there, breathing heavily. He ran a hand through his perfect hair, ruining it. He slumped into a chair, looking suddenly very young and very overwhelmed. 1.22 billion, he muttered. If I absorb that debt, Thorne Capital is finished. I'm leveraged to the hilt for this. I'll lose everything. He looked up at Annie. Can I back out? The contract is signed. You can't back out, she said, her mind already racing through international contract law. But you can nullify the specific clause if we prove bad faith concealment. But to do that, we need proof that von Amsel knew about the debt and actively hid it. We need his internal communications. We'll never get those, Julian said, putting his head in his hands. They're encrypted. German privacy laws are ironclad. Annie picked up the check he had written her. $50,000. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. You need to sleep, Mr. Thorne, she said. Sleep? I'm about to lose $1 billion. You're not going to lose anything tonight, she said firmly. The banks don't open until 9 a.m. That gives us 10 hours. Go home, shower, change. Meet me at your office at 7 a.m. And what are you going to do? He asked. She walked to the door. I'm going to go home to Queens, feed my cat, and make a few phone calls. My father didn't leave me money, Julian, but he left me contacts, and some of those contacts owe the Vance family a favor. She left him there, amidst the ruins of his dinner and the shards of his trust. The subway ride back to Queens took 40 minutes. She sat squeezed between a guy smelling of wet dog and a teenager blasting music, but her mind was in Munich. Who was von Amsel working with? Why target Julian? When she got to her tiny apartment, she didn't sleep. She opened her closet and pulled out an old, dusty box from the top shelf. Inside was her father's old Rolodex and a secure satellite phone he'd kept from his diplomatic days. She stared at the phone. It hadn't been charged in 2 years. She plugged it in. It flickered to life. She scrolled through the contacts. Ambassador Lee, General Harker, the Duchess of Kent. And then, a name she hadn't thought of in years. The Ghost. It wasn't a real name. It was a nickname for a forensic accountant named Silas, who used to work for the UN, tracking warlord money. He was the one who had tried to warn her father before the scandal broke. He was the only one who knew the truth. She dialed the number. It rang 4 times. This line is dead, a distorted voice answered. The owl flies at midnight, she said, the old code phrase her father used. Silence. Then a normal, gruff voice. Annie, is that you? Hello, Silas. I need a favor. I heard about Arthur, Silas said, his voice softening. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. You can't save him, she said. But you can save me. I need you to dig into a company called Rio Verde Holdings, and I need a link between them and Heinrich von Amsel. Von Amsel? The German steel king? Annie, you're playing with fire. That man eats governments for breakfast. I know, she said, but he's trying to eat my boss. And if my boss goes down, I don't get my check. And I really need that check, Silas. Give me 3 hours, Silas said. But Annie, be careful. Von Amsel isn't just a businessman. He's connected to the old money, the kind of money that kills people. The next morning, at 6:55 a.m., Annie walked into the lobby of Thorne Capital. The security guard stopped her. "Delivery's in the back, miss." She was wearing her best suit, a charcoal grey number she'd bought for interviews 3 years ago. It was tight in the shoulders, but it looked professional. "I'm not a delivery," she said. "I'm the new VP of International Strategy. Call Mr. Thorne." The guard smirked. "Yeah, right. And I'm the King of England." Just then, the elevator pinged. Julian stormed out into the lobby. He looked like he hadn't slept. He was wearing a fresh suit, but his eyes were bloodshot. "She's with me," Julian barked at the guard. "Let her through." The guard jumped back. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Sorry, sir." They rode the elevator up to the penthouse office. The view was incredible. All of Manhattan spread out like a toy set. But the mood inside was grim. "Did you find anything?" Julian asked the second the doors closed. "Better," she said. She pulled a folder out of her bag. She'd printed Silas's findings at an all-night cafe. "Rio Verde Holdings isn't owned by Von Amsel," she said. Julian frowned. "Then who owns it?" "It's owned by a blind trust in the Caymans," she explained. "But Silas, my contact, traced the IP address of the weekly status reports. They aren't going to Munich." "Where are they going?" "Tokyo," she said. Julian stopped walking. "Yamamoto?" "No," she said. "Yamamoto is honorable. He's being played too. The reports are going to a private server registered to Saito Heavy Industries." Julian gasped. "Saito? That's Yamamoto's biggest rival. They've been trying to hostile take over his company for a decade." "Exactly," Annie said. "Here is the play. Saito planted the toxic debt shell company. They bribed Marcus to slip it into the contract. When you bought the company, the debt would trigger a default. Thorne Capital would crash. The deal would fall apart. And in the chaos, Saito would swoop in and buy Yamamoto's company for pennies on the dollar. You were just the suicide bomber, Julian." Julian sank onto his leather sofa. "My God, it's a corporate assassination." "And Marcus was the trigger man," she added. "So what do we do?" Julian asked. "If I tell Yamamoto, he might not believe me. He might think I'm trying to wiggle out of the deal." "We don't tell him," she said, a dangerous smile forming on her lips. "We show him." "How?" "Tonight is the closing gala," she said. "Everyone will be there. Von Amsel, Yamamoto, and I bet a representative from Saito will be there observing. We are going to walk into that gala, and we are going to detonate the bomb. But not on you." Julian looked at her. For the first time, she saw respect in his eyes. Genuine, terrified respect. "You really are your father's daughter," he whispered. "No," she said, straightening her jacket. "My father was a diplomat. He believed in peace. I believe in winning. Now get me a secure line to Tokyo. I need to practice my Japanese insults." The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was a sea of black ties, diamonds, and deceit. The Aurora Gala was supposed to be a celebration of the merger, but Annie knew it was actually a crime scene waiting to happen. She wasn't wearing her apron anymore. At 4 p.m., Julian had sent a stylist to the office. She tried to refuse, arguing that her grey suit was fine, but Julian was adamant. "You are my weapon, Annie," he had said, looking at the city skyline. "You don't bring a knife to a gunfight, and you don't wear polyester to a billionaire's funeral." So now, she stood at the top of the velvet staircase, wearing a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, structured and sharp, with a neckline that suggested she was there to cut throats, not cake. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. She looked like money. She looked like power. Julian stood beside her. He looked nervous. He kept touching the cuff of his jacket, where he had hidden the flash drive containing Silas's evidence. "Breathe, Julian," she whispered, without moving her lips. "I'm breathing," he muttered. "I just see Marcus down there. And he's laughing." She looked down. Marcus was holding court near the ice sculpture, clinking glasses with a man she didn't recognize, a sharp-featured Japanese man in a grey suit who was smiling a little too widely. "That's him," she said, her pattern recognition kicking in. "The man with Marcus. That's the Saito representative." Julian stiffened. "How do you know?" "Body language," she observed. "He's standing with his feet pointed toward the exit, but his torso is angled toward Mr. Yamamoto across the room. He's hunting. He's waiting for the moment Yamamoto signs the ceremonial document tonight to initiate the default." "Who is he?" "I don't know," she said, "but we're about to find out." They descended the stairs. The room turned. People whispered. They knew Julian Thorne, the boy wonder of Wall Street, but they didn't know the woman on his arm. She heard snippets of French and Italian as they passed. "Qui est-elle?" "Who is she?" "È la nuova moglie." "Is that the new wife?" She ignored them. They made a beeline for the VIP circle where Heinrich von Amsel and Kenji Yamamoto were waiting. When von Amsel saw them, his eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Thorne? And, Gott im Himmel, is that the waitress?" Annie smiled, extending her hand. "Guten Abend, Herr von Amsel. Ich hoffe, die Börse war heute gnädig zu Ihnen." "Good evening, Mr. von Amsel. I hope the stock market was kind to you today." He chuckled, kissing her hand. Dangerous. A woman who remembers the markets and speaks the language. "Thorne, you are a lucky man." "I am," Julian said, his voice steel. "Gentlemen, before the speeches begin, Annie and I need to speak with you privately, in the library." Marcus appeared out of nowhere, like a bad smell. Now, Julian," Marcus smiled, his eyes darting to Annie with pure malice. "No need for secret meetings. We're all friends here. And Mr. Katsumi Saito has joined us to congratulate Mr. Yamamoto." The man in the grey suit stepped forward. "A pleasure," he said in perfect English. "Katsumi Saito, Senior VP of Saito Heavy Industries. We are keen observers of this deal." The air pressure in the circle dropped. Yamamoto looked at Saito coldly. They were rivals, after all. "Saito-san," Yamamoto said, bowing barely an inch, a deliberate insult. "We just want to ensure the stability of the market," Saito said smoothly. "Rumors of debt can be so damaging." He knew. He was taunting them. He knew about the Rio Verde Shell Company, and he was counting down the minutes until he could leak the information that Julian had bought a poisoned asset. Marcus smirked at Annie. "Nice dress, Annie. Did you rent it, or is it a parting gift?" He thought he had won. He thought she was just eye candy. She looked at Marcus. Then she looked at Saito. "It's not a gift, Marcus," she said, her voice projecting just enough to be heard by the circle. "It's a uniform." "For what?" Marcus laughed. "Serving drinks?" "No," she said, stepping closer to him. "For taking out the trash." She turned to Yamamoto. "Yamamoto-san, honor is the foundation of business, is it not?" Yamamoto nodded slowly. "It is." "And what is the punishment," she continued, switching seamlessly to Japanese, "for a retainer who opens the castle gates to the enemy in exchange for gold?" Saito's smile faltered. Marcus looked confused. He didn't speak Japanese. "What is she saying?" "I am saying," she switched back to English, "that we are going to the library. Now." She didn't wait for permission. She walked toward the private room. Julian followed. Yamamoto, intrigued by her tone, followed. Von Amsel followed. And because they had no choice, Marcus and Saito followed, walking into the lion's den. The library of the Plaza Hotel smelled of old leather and cigars. It was soundproof, perfect for what was about to happen. They stood around a long mahogany table. Julian locked the door. "This is highly irregular," Marcus stammered. "The press is waiting outside for the toast." "Shut up, Marcus," Julian said. He threw the folder of evidence onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and hit Saito's hand. "What is this?" Saito asked, feigning innocence. "That," Annie said, "is the routing number for a Cayman Islands account held by Rio Verde Holdings, and the corresponding IP logs showing the account is managed from a server in your Tokyo office, Saito-san." Saito went perfectly still. She turned to von Amsel. "Herr von Amsel, you were told that the $400 million debt in the Brazilian subsidiary was a temporary accounting error, correct? That's what Marcus told you?" Von Amsel looked at Marcus. "Yeah. He said it would be cleared before closing." "He lied," Annie said. "Marcus didn't clear it. He codified it. He buried it in the Portuguese appendix so that when Julian signed, the debt would activate, triggering a default clause in your contract with Yamamoto. Julian would go bankrupt. The deal would collapse." She turned to Yamamoto. "And who would be there to buy your company when its stock price crashed from the scandal? Who is the only other entity with enough capital to bail you out?" She pointed at Saito. "Saito Heavy Industries," Yamamoto whispered. The realization washed over him. He looked at Saito with pure fury. "Kisama, you bastard! This is ridiculous!" Marcus yelled, sweat pouring down his face. "She's lying. She's a waitress. She doesn't understand high finance. Julian, you're going to listen to a girl who pours coffee over your CFO." Julian stepped forward. He loomed over Marcus. "She's not a waitress, Marcus," Julian said softly. "She's the smartest person in this room, and she's my VP. You, however, are unemployed." "You can't prove I knew," Marcus shrieked. "It's my word against hers." "Actually," Annie interrupted, "it's your voice against your voice." She pulled out her phone. "While we were standing in the circle outside," she said, "I called my contact, Silas. He's a forensic audiologist. He's been monitoring the background frequency of this room since we walked in, but earlier today he tapped the microphone in your pocket." Marcus patted his chest. "I don't have a microphone." "No," she smiled. "But you have a phone, and you have the LinkedIn app installed. You gave it microphone permissions 3 years ago. Silas just remote activated it." She pressed play on her phone. A recording from 2 hours ago played. It was Marcus's voice, clear as day. "Don't worry, Mr. Saito. Julian is clueless. He thinks with his ego. He'll sign the papers, the debt will hit, and he'll be ruined by morning. Just make sure my transfer to the Swiss account is ready." The silence in the library was absolute. Marcus slumped against the wall, his legs giving out. Saito adjusted his tie. He was a professional. He knew when he had lost. "This recording," Saito said calmly to Julian, "it is illegal, inadmissible in court." "Maybe," Julian said, "but I don't need to go to court. I just need to go to the press outside. Imagine the headline, 'Saito Heavy Industries Caught in Corporate Sabotage Scandal.' Your stock will drop 20% by morning." Saito narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" "I want the debt gone," Julian said. "You are going to buy Rio Verde Holdings from us right now. For $1, you take the toxic asset back. And if I refuse, then Annie goes out there and gives the toast," Julian said, gesturing to her. "And she will give it in Japanese, German, and English, so every reporter in the world understands exactly what you did." Saito looked at Annie. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. He pulled out a checkbook. He wrote a check for $1. He signed a piece of paper Julian slid over to him, a transfer of ownership. "Pleasure doing business," Saito spat. He turned to leave. "Wait," Annie said. Saito stopped. "Yamamoto-san," she said in Japanese. "In our culture, when one attempts to stab a man in the back and fails, an apology is insufficient. A penalty is required." Yamamoto nodded grimly. He looked at his rival. "Saito, you will withdraw your bid for the chaotic battery patent in Seoul. You will leave that market to me." Saito's eyes bulged. That patent was worth millions. But he looked at the phone in Annie's hand, the recording that could end his career. He bowed stiffly to Yamamoto. "As you wish." He stormed out of the room. Now, only Marcus was left. He was sobbing quietly. "Julian, please," Marcus wept. "I have a mortgage. I have kids." "You should have thought of them before you sold me out," Julian said coldly. "Security is waiting outside. If I ever see you in New York again, I'll hand this recording to the FBI." Marcus fled. The door closed. It was just Annie, Julian, Yamamoto, and von Amsel. Von Amsel started laughing. It started as a chuckle and turned into a roar. "Incredible!" he shouted. "Absolutely incredible! I haven't had this much fun since the Berlin Wall came down." Yamamoto walked over to Annie. He took her hand in both of his. "Vance-san," he said, with deep respect. "You have saved my company. You have saved my honor. If you ever want to leave Mr. Thorne, you have a home in Tokyo." "Hey," Julian interjected, smiling. "Stop trying to poach my VP. She's under contract." Julian looked at Annie. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a warm glow in the room. They had done it. The $1.2 billion deal was safe. The bad guys were gone. "Shall we go get a drink?" Julian asked. "I believe there is a gala in our honor." "One condition," she said, smoothing her dress. "Anything," Julian said. "You carry the bread basket." She smiled. Julian laughed, a real, genuine laugh that reached his eyes. "Deal." They walked back out to the ballroom. The flashbulbs went off. The applause started. But as she looked at the crowd, Annie realized the story wasn't over. Saving the deal was one thing, but Arthur Vance's name was still tarnished, and the man who had framed her father, the real architect of her misery, wasn't Marcus or Saito. They were just pawns. As she scanned the room, she saw a figure standing in the shadows of the balcony, a man watching her with a glass of scotch in his hand. It was Senator Sterling, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and her father's old boss. He raised his glass to her, a silent acknowledgement. He knew who she was, and he knew she was coming for him next. The morning after the gala, the headlines didn't mention the near collapse of the deal. They read, "Thorne Capital secures historic €1.2 billion Asian alliance." There was a photo of Julian shaking hands with Yamamoto and von Amsel, but if you looked closely, in the background, slightly out of focus, was a woman in a blue dress. Annie stood in her new office. It was next to Julian's with the same view of Central Park, but her nameplate, Annie Vance, VP of Strategy, was still being engraved. Her desk was covered in flowers, orchids from Yamamoto, a case of Riesling from von Amsel, and a single, slightly crushed dandelion from the crack in the sidewalk outside, placed in a crystal vase. That last one was from Julian, a joke about roots. The door opened, and Julian walked in. He looked refreshed, the weight of the world lifted off his shoulders. "Board meeting in 10 minutes, he said, leaning against the doorframe. "We need to discuss the integration timeline, and I need you to translate a voicemail from an Italian supplier. He sounds angry, but he might just be passionate about cheese." Annie smiled, picking up her tablet. "I'll handle it." "You know," Julian said, his voice turning serious. "You could have taken credit last night. You could have told the press you saved the company. And become a target?" She shook her head. "Power is quiet, Julian. You taught me that. Well, you tried to teach me that when you were yelling at me about bread." He winced. "I'm never going to live that down, am I?" "No," she said. "It's going to be in my memoir." He laughed and turned to leave. "Coming." "Give me a minute," she said. "I have one more call to make." Julian nodded and closed the door. The smile dropped from her face instantly. She walked over to the window, looking out at the city that had chewed her family up and spit them out. She pulled the secure satellite phone from her purse. It buzzed. An incoming message from Silas. Subject: Sterling message. "I found the link. The senator authorized the transfer that framed your father, but the paper trail is buried in a private server in Zurich. We need access." She looked at the message. Senator Sterling, the man she had seen on the balcony. He thought he was safe. He thought Arthur Vance's daughter was just a waitress who got lucky. He didn't know she now had the resources of a billion-dollar conglomerate behind her. He didn't know she had the trust of the Japanese tech giants and German industrialists. She typed a reply. "Get the team ready. I'm going to Zurich next month for the integration meetings. We're going hunting." She put the phone away and picked up her notebook. She wasn't just Annie the waitress anymore. She wasn't just Annie the VP. She was the background noise that was about to bring the whole house down. She opened the door and walked into the boardroom. Julian was waiting. He pulled out a chair, not because she was a woman, and not because she was staff, but because she was his partner. "Shall we begin?" Julian asked the room. She looked at the board members, the lawyers, the sharks. "Yes," she said, in English, then French, then Mandarin. "Let's get to work." And that is how a spilled glass of water turned into a $1.2 billion empire. Annie Vance didn't just save a deal, she dismantled a stereotype. In a world that constantly tried to tell her she was nothing, she proved that knowledge is the only currency that never devalues. Julian Thorne learned the hard way that the person serving your food might just be the only person smart enough to save your life. It's a reminder to never underestimate the background noise of society, because you never know who is listening, and more importantly, you never know who is ready to speak up. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, intelligence, and high-stakes power plays, smash that like button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Do you think Julian deserved a second chance? Or should Annie have taken the money and left him to fail? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. I'll see you in the next video.